Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Nicole Stephensen here from my office in Brisbane, and I am joined by my wonderful colleague and friend, Mr. Malcolm Crompton. And Malcolm is joining me today as part of the Cybersafety group, Put Kids First Virtual Summit Redux, because we missed being able to have this opportunity to speak together when we were in that larger online panel session with Pari Aftab from her home in New York. We had some challenges with the internet connection that day, and we really wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to speak to Malcolm directly and hear his views that we would have loved to have heard during that panel session. Now, before I get going with my discussion with Malcolm, I think I should introduce him to those of you who don't know him personally. Now, Malcolm Crompton is, as I said, a wonderful friend of mine. He has been a mentor of mine in the privacy space for pretty much my entire career. So we're talking, nearly 20 years. And I met Malcolm during his time as a privacy commissioner in Australia. So he is a former privacy commissioner here. He's also the founder of a wonderful privacy services firm called Information Integrity Solutions, and they have done some exceptional work in the privacy space over the years that I've known Malcolm. So without further ado, welcome Malcolm to Put Kids First.
Thank you, and hello, Nicole. Hello, everybody.
So, Malcolm, we talked about a number of different things in the panel session that I hosted earlier in the week. And I think for completeness, it would be really important for those who attended the virtual summit to hear your views on those same topics. And of course, we will, you and I together, have a bit of a different spin because we operate in that exclusive privacy domain, right? But if you don't mind, I will sort of reprise those questions, and I'd love you to take us down the various different rabbit holes as a result.
Sure.
Okay. So my first question relates to the topic of sharenting. It's this idea that parents and grandparents post with a degree of prolific vim and vigor the images and videos of their children and grandchildren online. And we see this profiled in the media from time to time about how potentially inappropriate that behavior is. Now, do you think sharenting from your perspective is a thing? And is it a negative or concerning behavior from a privacy perspective?
Nicole, many of my answers will be it depends kinds of answers, and this is another it depends kind of answer. I think people have to be responsible in what they do. They have to think about what the implications are of what they do. So not sharing any photographs or lives of your children or grandchildren with others is very sad. Sharing prolifically everything about your children with everybody is not smart either. At worst, quite innocently, you could share a photograph of a naked child, 2 years old or 3 years old, and you've got all your privacy settings on wide open. Anybody can see. Well, you've just opened your child up to child abuse. Very simple. What we therefore need to do is to think about how to be sensible and safe online. So the first thing a parent can do is actually consciously find out what the privacy settings are on whatever network or platform they're using, and think about the implications of those privacy settings, and maybe make it, family only or invited people only or something else like that. That's the first thing to do. Obvious other things are just plain old safety and security. Is your computer patched, up to date, not compromised, etc. But the first thing to do is really be careful with whom you share, and trust those people or ask them not to on-share. Because once you send a photograph out into the world, even to 5 people, one of those people could be silly enough to say, look at my grandchild or nephew or something like that, to another group of people, and then there's somebody in that group who is irresponsible. So you've got to be it's a cat out of the bag problem. You have to be very careful. But around that is the problem that the platforms profit from greater sharing. so that platforms encourage sharing and are relatively quiet about the risks of sharing. So we have to be very, very careful that sometimes we are on our own here, each parent, each grandparent, and that the only person who's going to look after your interests and your child's interests are you. Think about it very carefully, but please, please, please don't stop sharing. Just do it wisely.
Yeah, look, that's really sensible, and it's something that your average mums and dads who are dealing with wanting to be, connected and keeping their children visible to friends and family and what's happening in life. That's a sensible approach. I do sometimes worry, though, that when we're asked to read 20 and 30 and 50-page privacy policies and terms and conditions, the average parent may not understand what it is they're reading, not really understand that the personal information they're sharing, whatever it is on those platforms, whether it's images or some other kind of information, that then can be on-sold or used in a different way that suits the company that's hosting the information.
Well, I think I can give you a useful summary of every single social networking platform's privacy policy. It's one sentence, and therefore that's all you need in your head. Plan from there. And the sentence is this: we will collect everything about you that we can, from any platform that we can, in any way that we can, keep it forever, use it for anything, and sell it to anybody. Click here to give your permission.
Yeah.
That's the start point. Sometimes you're given some controls of, like in many of the social platforms, you can share with friends, or you can share with a nominated group of people, or there are some controls that you can bring down on that. And so separately from any of those ridiculous privacy statements, what you need to do is go onto the platform and get to know it. It's a bit like driving the car. Now, you don't hop into the car and just drive. You had driving lessons and got a driving license, and you had to develop competence after you became a P-plater to be a good driver. Same thing here. You've got to look after yourself and be responsible.
Yeah, look, that's
and
a great...
remember, sorry.
I was just going to say that's such a great point about digital literacy, right? That we mustn't forget we may have a number of rights that are associated with our privacy, but we also have a responsibility to understand the platforms that we're using.
Yep, they are. And they are immensely complicated. Now, it's a funny trade-off in a way. The more granular the controls, the more controls there are to set. So if you go to the LinkedIn profile, or you go to the Facebook thing, there are dozens and dozens of settings that you can take control of. And because of the way these platforms are built, the defaults are always open. And that's what really makes me cranky about some of the social networks, is when they introduce a new control, the default is open. So you actually have to go back and recheck your settings periodically to find out what fancy pants new control they've implemented. But in the meantime, you are deemed to have consented to the open setting of that new fancy pants control until you have closed it down. So this is a constant vigilance issue as well.
And for parents, you think about how sort of time poor and overworked and overwhelmed so many parents are, and when they are relying on various platforms, whether it's for sharing of information about their children or whether it's to actually keep their children occupied, that sort of that regular and almost hypervigilance can go out the window.
Yes, but there are some things you can do that are relatively simple to do that seem to at least improve things, which is literally compare platforms. For some of the baby share platforms, and I could name one of them, starts off much more controlled. Because so the Facebooks of this world are appallingly open until you close down. Yeah. So is LinkedIn. Even Twitter, the very high profile ones, but then there are the ones that are specifically aiming at parents, and they do seem to be where you set it up and then you consciously invite people in. You know, you'd invite in the uncles and the aunts and the grandparents in. So you've got a closed group of people with whom you're sharing, which is a terrific start. So it starts off closed until you open the door to the right amount. But then you still have to educate all the other people who've joined that group is please don't share it outside that platform, because they're usually allowed for downloads, for example. So you could easily download the photograph on even a family shared kind of platform. Some Uncle Joe downloads it, and Uncle Joe then shares it with a bunch of friends. Out of control.
You know, this kind of brings to mind for me conversations that I have from time to time, whether it's within our industry or, you know, platform vendors, perhaps even parents or other parents or members of my own family, where, you know, I talk about privacy settings and I talk about being careful and knowing what your children are doing online, those sorts of things. And someone inevitably is going to say to me, well, what does it all matter anyway? Privacy is dead. And this level of discussion just almost always gets my back up, because I don't think that's the case at all. I think, in fact, privacy may be changing in terms of who is taking more responsibility and more accountability for outcomes. But the fact that privacy is a thing and that there are principles that are meant to guide how personal information is collected and used and disseminated and all of those things, I think this is very alive and well. And I worry that the idea that privacy is dead might be a dangerous takeaway for our children. And I'd like to hear your comments on that.
It's positive. Yeah. It's positively stupid, and everybody in their everyday behaviour shows at least some level of privacy. Full stop, end of story. We may be all different about it, but very few people really like having anybody looking in through their bathroom window. Full stop. There'd be very few sane parents who would like to think that their child might be exposed to child abuse, even if it's simply download of a photograph and it being used in a nasty way by somebody else, and or photoshopped with somebody. You know, there's all sorts of disgusting things that can be done with an image. So there are limits that are so there are extremes that are so extreme. There'd be barely a parent on the planet, other than a child abuser themselves, who would do anything except know that's beyond the pale. So that means we have all agreed that there is at least some privacy that we all want. There is simply no debate about the fact that we all want some privacy for different reasons. It might be modesty, it might be child exploitation, it might be government is peering through my virtual bedroom window just a bit too much, but we're all going to have reasons. What is interesting in the privacy debate, I think, is that as soon as you use the word privacy, it's become one of these overused words without explanation. And so you say privacy and it becomes boring, deadening, compliance. There's no reasoning behind it. But if you start talking about actual issues that concern people, the message gets through very quickly. And after that, we're having a discussion about what's acceptable in your domain, in your life. Then we have a separate question, which is how clearly can you understand what is going on? And that is where I just bring up what the ACCC said in regard to the digital platforms, in the digital platforms inquiry that came out last year. And in essence, they said that the digital platforms have set out to consciously mislead the public. So it's not just a matter of people not understanding the implications of what they're doing. They are surrounded by very powerful influences that sets out to mislead them on the risks that they are facing. Now, beyond that, the risks are the kind of risks that ordinary human beings are genetically very poorly built to handle, very poorly built to handle. And that is this, that short-term reward for long-term pain as a trade-off is almost impossible for us to understand and deal with rationally. And there are these Nobel Prize winners, Kahneman et al., showed this a long time ago now. they can even have statisticians who know exactly what's going on statistically and mathematically make the same mistakes instinctively, because that's how it's built in our genes. And the platforms are consciously exploiting that inability that's built into every human being. So we have a whole series of challenges or difficulties that makes it hard for us to get it right, which is why we have to be so careful. But I just think it's one of these things where we've overused the word privacy to the point where it's become a numbing word, a negative word, and we need to change the discussion to a more realistic or conversation that hits home to how you lead your life, whoever you are.
It is often, isn't it, about small actions, small things that you can do to minimize your risk in a very big way.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
if we talk about the privacy of ourselves in our homes, for example, what do you do to make yourself less visible or less observable? You close and lock your door and you close your blinds.
Exactly.
Right? There
Yes.
are the equivalent mechanisms and controls that we have available to us in this digital universe that we're operating in now. But we do need to know that they are there. And for our children, I think it's really important that if they don't have the capacity yet to know they're there, as mums and dads, it's our job to teach them about that. And these things can be taught in entirely age-appropriate ways, right? Entirely age-appropriate ways. If your child is in a chat room, for example, that they shouldn't be in when they're in online gaming, a great question to ask them is, okay, do you know the person you're talking to right now? And they say, well, oh, no, they're just they're my online friend, or they're the friend of my avatar. And you say, okay, so should we just go outside then and meet a random person and become their friend, and then take them back to your bedroom, and you can sit in the bedroom by yourselves and have that conversation? The child automatically reacts to that sense of having their personal and private space invaded by a real person. Yeah. So you can have those conversations.
Yeah. And as the child gets older, that, as you say, the age-appropriate conversation changes. And there's some wonderful research being done by Dana Boyd in the US, which shows that, in fact, in adolescence, people of that age have some incredibly clever strategies for managing the privacy that they're conscious of. It's just they're not conscious of all of the privacy risks, but it does mean they're aware of it. And one of the points that she was making was that often, in particular, these people at that age want to begin to exert some privacy from their parents.
Yes.
So that, and they do it very cleverly. One of the little examples that she gave was of a young girl who, somebody in her teens, who'd just broken up with a boyfriend, and she knew that mum was compulsorily one of her friends on the social media platform. So one of the things that this girl did was to play a particular song, or give a link to a particular song that she knew all of her friends would understand as saying, I'm feeling a bit down, I'm feeling a bit lonely, and please understand that. But she knew that what mum would do is to say, isn't that a sweet song, darling? And that mum wouldn't get the real message. And they, that one of the reasons why some of the online language changes by the month is coding. It's literally coding. That that the in-group, or whatever the current term is, will get it, and that the others won't. And that usually your parents are slower at this than your friends. So there's all sorts it's not as if people at various ages aren't asserting some privacy controls. It's just what they're trying to control and how they're trying to control it may vary. And they may be very, very blind to some of the other risks that they face, including because of the conscious manipulation by the platforms of our inability to do short-term gain trade-offs against long-term risk trade-offs, which we are, genetically incapable of managing well.
So now this leads me to, one of the questions that really became quite interesting when we spoke as a panel earlier in the week. I had posed the question about, what about all of these Internet of Things technologies, right? And that includes our digital platforms in my estimation, in terms of the way that they've just made their way into mainstream in our lives, right? But I'm talking about everything from your home assistants to your use of social media to the the enabled baby monitors or your smart fridges or whatever they happen to be. These all carry with them an inherent level of risk, and particular technologies carry a higher degree of risk for children, particularly where those children may be able to be observed going about their private life by someone who doesn't have the right intention in mind. But what that conversation during the week raised was that we're in this very strange place in terms of regulation, privacy regulation, and regulation of technologies, and enforcement of that regulation. The ability to marry up our obligations with what we're actually doing with some kind of clarity and regularity. And I really wanted to hear your views on that. You made some really salient points just at the end of that panel session during the week that I know Parry and I are really hoping that you'll expand on for us.
Sure. First of all, there are certain things that we just can't get right. And one of them is the seatbelt example actually used by Kahneman, which is that if we are just told to wear the seatbelt, most of us don't. Instead, what we do is the way we get people to wear seatbelts is make it compulsory, because we actually have this God complex. We all have the God complex, which says it can't happen to me. So until we're compelled to wear the seatbelts, we aren't actually wearing seatbelts at the socially optimal level and stop killing ourselves. Mm-hmm. So there's that risk. There is the risk of being misled, which I've already described. And again, we need to think about how that has evolved. So in the 20 years I've been doing data privacy, it's moved from being blindingly obvious that this is going to happen to it has now happened, that our lives are digitally dominated. Mm-hmm. And so it's no longer much of a nice to have. It's become a, gee, you really ought to have it.
Yeah.
So to you really must have it. So, and I come back to the motor car as a little model of two things that we can think about for data. One of the things is the only way it makes it reasonably safe to drive, because after all, people are still dying on the road, is the triplet of safe highway, safe car, safe driver. No one of those three dimensions can deliver all the results.
Yes.
So we need to have governments or tollway providers give us highways that are safe enough to a standard. We need to have motor cars that are safe enough to a standard. We need to have drivers that are safe enough to a standard. And each of those are actually standardized. There are rules for each of those levels, but don't expect any one of them to get it right, which is what we were discussing before about sharenting. Sharenting is only at one of those three levels. It's not the other two.
Yes.
The other one is the history of the motor car, which is that for the first 60 or so years of the life of the motor car, commerce made the car faster and safer. From about 1890, when Benz and others developed the motor car, up to the 50s and 60s, we had faster, safer motor cars. It's just that then Ralph Nader wrote a book which everybody should still read called Unsafe at Any Speed. And Unsafe at Any Speed showed how dangerous some of the cars on the road were. And it was very clear that the commercial drivers were not going to clean that up. So instead, law came in to move the safety levels delivered by commercial activity, the market clearing activity, to the socially desired level of safety. And only law could bridge that gap. And that is why the cars that we drive today are so much safer than the cars made in the 1960s. There isn't a commercial solution to that gap. There will always be that gap.
And
so
that's why the internet that we're driving today is currently not safe at any speed.
Yes, exactly. So what we need to give some thought to is almost everything in our life has been made safe for us by a standard model that we haven't yet properly applied to data. And the standard model is simply this. Somebody writes a framework, you could call it a standard, you could call it a law, you could call it a framework, you could call it rules. I don't care what you call it. Somebody has said, this is the way you should do things. The second part is that you then have somebody else who says, are you meeting those requirements? And there's all sorts of ways of doing that. And then the third thing is, if it's really difficult, the market does not self-regulate itself to that framework, you pass a law, and then you have an enforcement process. And we haven't done any of that on data in the same way as we have on motor cars. Or think about it, your doctor, the airplane pilot, the airplane, the building that you're in, the clothes that you're wearing, because your clothes could actually have been carcinogenic, except that they were made to a standard. There's nothing in your life that hasn't been made safe by that model, which is a third party who you've never met, who you trust literally with your life to keep you safe.
Yeah.
Now let's apply that thinking to data. For example, with the motor car, Parliament or Congress has never yet and never will design a motor car. All that Parliament said was, nobody is allowed to sell a motor car anymore that doesn't meet the requirements of a standard. There shall be a standards testing body and a standards setting body, and off you go. Somebody else designs the car, somebody else tests the car. Let's get down to data. Financial information governance is done that way. There are audit standards and there are auditors, and government says no company is allowed to list on the stock exchange unless it has a current audit certificate. Exactly the same model. The result is, from a very crude estimate I obtained in Britain, 10 billion British pounds are spent every year by companies in Britain to get their financial audits in place. Now tell me what the corresponding figure is for personal information governance in Britain. You can bet your trousers that it isn't 10 billion pounds. It may not be 100 million pounds, or £1 billion. It may be only 10 million pounds, a tiny figure. And it's only going to happen when parliaments step in. I'm not quite sure how the world will resolve on this. What I do know is the current situation is A, unacceptable, and B, unstable. It is going to change.
Yeah.
The only thing we don't know is how quickly it's going to change. So
100%.
we are seeing the initial developments emerging. For example, the spanking that the Federal Trade Commission gave to Facebook last year required Facebook to pay a fine of $5 billion. That may actually be the first fine Facebook has ever paid that it actually felt as a twitch. I mean, that's only a couple of days' earnings, just a minor cost of doing business. All the other fines Facebook has ever faced are measured in seconds of revenue earnings. So we have to think massively differently about what incentives do the large firms have to face before they'll actually pay attention. So
and
Facebook is handing over.
That's interesting, Malcolm, because even the FTC, I think, look, they're sending a message, right? And I think that message is, it's time for us to be doing this properly and not in this, this piecemeal approach, or not in this light-handed approach, and not in, you can't guide these horses to drink at that watering hole, right? It's not going to happen.
And to get them to stop cheating, quite frankly, the reason the fine was so big included the fact that the Facebook already had a consent agreement in place that required external audit on which Facebook cheated.
Yeah.
So Federal Trade Commission eventually got around to saying, you have been cheating on your compliance, and now we're going to make it really hurt, which is why the Facebook consent agreement for the $5 billion is really interesting at this particular point. Let me come around to it. They require in the consent agreement for the $5 billion that there shall be an independence privacy program assessment. There is a sentence here which is rather long, but I'll read it because it's got an extraordinarily good point in it. The assessment must be obtained from one or more qualified, objective, independent, third-party professionals selected subject to reasonable approval by an independent committee who uses procedures and standards generally accepted in the profession, conducts an independent review of the mandated privacy program, retains 5 years and makes them available to the Federal Trade Commission. This is all about specifying no get-out holes on this, and that will be the way of the future. That will become the standard approach to independent assessment.
Yeah. And I think that's a perfect place to leave our discussion today, because what it says to me is that within the privacy profession, there is a call to action out there that we can respond to. And it also, in terms of the protection of children's space, that online safety, cyber safety, putting kids first, this idea of having standards, enforcement, and individuals who are behind the scenes auditing this, I think that that's the place where we need to say, hey, this is our call to action, and this is where we can make a difference.
Yeah. I mean, right now, the privacy laws may that by what the Privacy Commissioner of Australia has done by taking Facebook to court.
Yes.
But, for example, is actually nothing to stop the privacy commissioners in Australia saying, if you meet this particular standard, whether it's an IEEE standard or an ISO standard or an Australian standard, we will consider you to have met your security principle requirements. We do not need more standards. We simply need to make a call on which of those standards, and it could be ISO 27, 017 or whatever it is, I can't remember its number.
Oh, the 27,001
series, guys.
Yes.
That's right, sorry. So let's get going, guys. Everything's there, ready to go. The gun just needs to be locked and loaded.
Yeah, it does. Malcolm, I'm eternally grateful that you took the time to join me for a second time and that you've had much better connectivity today than we experienced last time. So on behalf of the Cybersafety Group and our friend and colleague, Parry Aftab, and of course, myself, privacy professionals and children all around the world, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
A pleasure, great pleasure.
Thank you.